health items, such as medicine, doctor fees, medical tests, and hospitalization. But we're not going to discuss the health expenditure in this presentation. All consumption expenditures are in 2011 real prices. So our analysis will look at changes in food consumption patterns during the early stages and second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in India. It includes analysis on food expenditure, food shares, and food expenditure and shares by food items. We will look at overall trends from 2019 to 2021 by socio-economic status, and also we will run multivariate regressions to look at the marginal effects of some of variables of interest. So the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on total expenditure per capita, especially during mid-2020 when there was a severe lockdown nationally in India. So the total expenditure per capita went down from around 1,812 on average for the Indian household to 1,166 in mid-2020. It went up to 1,502 in mid-2021. It's by mid-2021, total expenditure per capita was still 17.1% lower than the pre-pandemic level in mid-2019. Food expenditure per capita was also more impacted in mid-2020 compared to mid-2021, although not as significantly as total expenditure per capita because food expenditures is less elastic. And by mid-2021, it was still about 7% lower than the pre-pandemic level. Households with children age 6 or younger experience a slightly smaller percentage decline in food expenditure per capita in mid-2020 and recovered faster in wave 2 compared to households without children age 6 or younger. This is the non-conditional analysis when we look at the conditional analysis on the changes of food expenditure by the presence of children age 6 or younger. We will see a slightly different finding. Non-expenditure per capita declined by a lot more than food expenditure per capita, by almost half between mid-2019 and mid-2020. So in mid-2019, non-food expenditure per capita was about 981 on average. It went down to 519 by mid-2020. It went up to 728 by mid-2021, but it was still about 26% lower in mid-2021 compared to the pre-pandemic level. And we run multivariate regression to look at the marginal impact of some of variables of interest, including changes in the total household income, a set of experiential food security indicators. These are subjective indicators of food security, such as the ability for households to buy food items during the COVID-19 and other barriers to buying food items during the COVID-19 pandemic, and whether a household member is sick, and the share of working household members whose current work and work prospect impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the share of household members who are employed and unemployed, and whether they are willing and whether they are looking for a job. And by social protection participation, such as Jatnan, LPG, pension, provident fund, PDS, BPL, and other ration cards. Household characteristic in 2019, we also control for household characteristics in 2019, including income group, age group, the presence of children's age 6 years or younger, education group, occupation group, gender group, household size, and the location, rural or urban. We run an analysis regression controlled by district dummies. We weighted the regression by rate weights. It's a weighting techniques to make uh, the sample more representative of the initial distributions of the target population, and we cluster the standard errors at the district level. Here are some of the highlights from the multivariate regressions that we run. So before we run the regression, so the unconditional changes in the household food expenditure is a decline by about 680 rupees per month. Using the multivariate regression of panel respondents by regressing changes in their food expenditure on a set of explanatory variables, we found that higher deciles experienced larger food expenditure declines. One decile group higher increased the decline in food expenditure by about 248 rupees. 100 rupees of income loss in real term in 2011 prices resulted in 0.3 rupees loss in food expenditure, controlling for other explanatory variables. There was no evidence that constrained access to buying food affected changes in food expenditure. So from the supply, we don't see any evidence from the supply side that affects this decline in food expenditure. The higher the share of working household members whose employment was impacted by the pandemic, the higher the reduction in food expenditure. So this is there is this evidence of the impact from the demand side of employment-related shocks on the decline in food expenditure. Receiving one extra kilogram of meat from public distribution system lowered the decline in food expenditure by 5 rupees. Households with children aged 6 or younger experienced larger food expenditure declines by about 109 rupees per month compared to households without children aged 6 years or younger. Households with more educated members experienced lower declines in food expenditure. Some households with main occupations such as agricultural laborers, home workers, professionals, retired wage laborers, white-collar professionals had smaller declines in food expenditure compared to the control occupation, that is legislators, social workers, and activists. Female-only households experienced larger declines in food expenditure by about 131 rupees per month compared to male-only households. And households located in rural areas experienced lower declines in food expenditure by about 140 rupees per month compared to those in urban areas. Other explanatory variables are not significant at 10% confidence interval. So these are the regression coefficients. Moving from food expenditure now to food shares. As food expenditure is inelastic, food share increased during early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic and stayed higher than the pre-pandemic period during the second wave in 2021 by about 5 percentage points. So before the pandemic in mid-2019, Indian households spend about, on average, around 49% of their expenditure on food. By mid-2020, the food share increased to 58.3%. It went down by mid-2021 to 53.8%. Increases in food share in mid-2020 were larger for higher deciles than decline for all deciles in mid-2021. Except for the lowest decile, food shares remain higher in mid-2021 compared to the pre-pandemic level. So how did social economic factors affect changes to food share between 2019 and 2020? Using multivariate regressions of changes in food share out of total expenditure on social economic variables, we found that the higher the decile, the higher the increase in food share. And that's partly because of the base effect, since higher decile households had higher non-food share to begin with. One decile group higher increased changes in food share by about 2 percentage points. Households with children aged 6 years or younger experienced no significant difference in food share changes compared to households without children aged 6 years or younger. Household categorized as female majority and only females have higher increases in food share compared to male majority and only males respectively. Households with more significant income losses experience a higher increase in food share, and these changes in income and changes in income from the whole household, for example, via government transfer, instead of changes in income from individual members of household, for example, via individual wages, drove this result. All other variables are not significant at 10% confidence interval. I will let Owen to take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Maybe you can continue to control the slides.
Yes.
So now we will switch to the individual food items. We had a sneak peek at this in the opening slide, but now we'll look in a bit more depth. So as was the case with overall food expenditure, when we look at the individual items, there was the decline from 2019 to 2020, followed by a partial rebound in 2021. That was the story for nearly all of the food categories, with the exception of edible oils. So you can see here the larger items in the food basket: cereals, milk products, vegetables and spices. They all declined fairly sharply and then rebounded somewhat in 2021. They all remain below the pandemic level, except for edible oils, as I mentioned. You see these smaller numbers on the right also. Beverages and health supplements, purchased and packaged food, food in restaurants, and we'll come back to these in future slides. Next, please. So now we're switching from the levels in rupee terms on the previous slide and looking at these percent changes. The blue bars are the percent change from 2019 to 2020, and the orange bars are the two-year change from 2019 to 2021. You can see where the steepest declines happened from 2019 to 2020. Food in restaurants, the far right, was an 80% decline over that 1 year. Not surprisingly. Other steep declines were coming from purchased and packaged food at over 50%, dried fruits at almost 40%, but we've highlighted here that the animal protein-rich food like eggs, meat, and fish had a 35% decline, so that was one of the largest declines of any of the food items. It remained almost 8% below its pre-pandemic level as of 2021. Next, please. So switching from food expenditure to food shares, households allocated somewhat less to cereals and pulses, sugar and other sweeteners, beverages and health supplements, purchased and packaged food, and dried fruits, and relatively more to edible oils, milk products, vegetables, fruit, animal protein-rich food. Overall, this would seem, and we welcome some insights on this, but it would seem that at least relatively speaking, even if the expenditure levels have declined, that the basket has shifted somewhat towards more nutritious food patterns. And here what we're showing in the percent change is the two-year change, the 2019 to 2021. Are those yellow bars, the yellow dots on the figure. Next, please. So continuing on this sort of possible theme of somewhat healthier behaviors, at least in relative terms, within a smaller overall envelope of food spending. We saw this very steep decline in the share of food eaten in restaurants, not surprisingly given the lockdown in the middle of 2020 and the weeks that followed. But it rebounded quite significantly by mid-2021, although still somewhat lower than the pre-pandemic level. Next. So that was the food story, and then we were also interested to look at health-related behaviors of cigarettes and tobacco and alcohol. And here it seems to be a somewhat different story with apparently less healthy behavior. So the share of intoxicants, cigarettes, BDs, other tobacco, actually increased in mid-2021. The shares there, the second set of bars, cigarette and tobacco, that actually increased even in 2020. The share going to cigarettes and tobacco increased. So the decline in overall intoxicants you see on the far left was actually driven by alcohol on the far right, while the cigarettes and tobacco actually increased slightly in share, not only from 2019 to 2020, but also from 2020 to 21. So not the cutbacks in cigarette and tobacco that one would hope to see. Next slide, please. So unpacking a little bit this story on the eggs, meat and fish, and more protein-rich spending. Households on average reduced their expenditure by 103 rupees per month. So that's the unconditional, without controlling for other variables. When we looked at this through a multivariate regression on the change from 2019 to 2020, so we found that higher decile groups reduced their expenditure more, so being 1 decile higher, sort of accentuated this decline in spending on this category by 25 rupees. A higher share of household members who were unemployed or not looking for a job also exacerbated the decline in this category. Receiving 1 kilogram of wheat food PDS mitigated the decline, only by a small margin, 1 rupee per extra kilo received. Households that had children aged 6 or younger, and we should add that was, I think, about 13% of the sample, they experienced higher declines in animal protein-rich food expenditure compared to households without kids under 6, but this difference was not significant. So overall, at least for this variable, not a significant difference between households with and without young children. In households with more educated household members experience smaller declines in this category. Next, please. Those are the regression coefficients. So this is sort of looking a bit more closely at households with kids under 6. So we control for other variables through the regression. These households experienced larger declines in food expenditure, but we found that most of these declines were coming from the somewhat less nutritious food categories. So sugar and other sweeteners, edible oils, beverages, purchased and packaged foods. So the blue bar at the left is the overall decline, overall difference in food expenditure between those with kids under 6 and those without, and then unpacking it. The blue bars are the significant, were significant at 10% confidence interval. So you see those declines for the categories that are, with the exception of fruit and dried fruit, less healthy, less nutritious. And then on the right-hand side, the white bars, those were not statistically significant at 10%. So where there were cutbacks, it seems there were less nutritious items. Next, please. Okay, this is sort of the last subsection before we conclude. And here what we did was to do multivariate regressions and look at the determinants of changes in the food shares on each of these individual items. So I'll go through several slides just unpacking the increase or decrease in the share for each of these items and across socioeconomic groups. So starting with cereals, whole grains, bread noodles, and so forth, 2 percentage point decrease on average of the share in the food basket, the household expenditure basket. And you see that this was somewhat higher decrease on the lower deciles, over 3% in the bottom decile. less than 1% in the richest decile. And the regression results, besides this sort of difference across deciles, we found that the decline was also less severe for smaller households. Remember, we're looking at shares and not expenditures here, so it's not just because they're smaller households, the decline was less severe. And also in urban households, compared to rural, there seemed to be a larger decrease. So switching to milk and milk products here, the food share for this category increased by 2 percentage points. See that this increase was generally smaller for the higher deciles, the exception perhaps of the top decile. The increase was higher for households with children under 6 or younger, but just marginally significant. The increase was highest among the better educated households. Smaller households had higher increases than larger households on this. And then you see some of the occupational categories, employees, industrial workers, retired, self-employed, so on and so forth, had smaller increases relative to the benchmark category. Next. So edible oils, the share increased. The increase was larger for higher deciles, about somewhat over 1 percentage point increase. The increase was less for households with kids under 6. Smaller sized households had lower increases than larger ones. Next. So coming back to the enriched protein category, as we saw, the average food share here declined by 1 percentage point, but quite a gradient, quite a large difference between lower and higher deciles, with sharper decreases among the poor. We also found that female majority households experienced larger declines by 1 percentage point, but that's compared to the female-only households. No other significant controls here. Next. So moving to some of the less nutritious items like purchased and packaged food, quite a steep decline in this category compared to the others. The average food share declined by 3 percentage points, and this was a much larger increase among the richer deciles, as one might expect, for over 5 percentage point decline in the top decile. And then looking at the multivariate regression results, one decile group higher translated into increased higher decline by 0.3 percentage points. The decline was larger for households with kids under 6. So again, what we saw earlier, that the cutbacks in households with children under 6 seem to come in the less nutritious categories, and some differences among large households. Next. A somewhat similar storyline for food in restaurants, a much larger decline among the better off. Of course, they would have a higher baseline expenditure in this category. The regression results, the decrease was more severe for the higher deciles, with one decile group higher being associated with a decrease in the decline by 0.02 percentage points, although that was not significant. The decline was more severe for households with kids under 6, most severe in single member households. Next. And then back to the pan, tobacco and liquor, average share of the decline was 0.1 percentage points, but interestingly here quite a lot of variation across the deciles, with slight increases in the poorest deciles and sharper decreases in the richer deciles. So one decile group higher was associated with a larger decline by 0.08 percentage points. The least educated households had the largest declines. The male only or balanced, in other words, sort of male-female male-dominant households had larger declines compared to the female-only households. Again, perhaps a base effect where there was higher spending on these categories among the male-only and male-dominant households. Smaller households tended to experience smaller declines this year, and rural households also had smaller declines compared to the urban. Next. So that brings us to the end, and just to sort of summarize some of these points. So the impact of COVID on food expenditure and food shares varied quite significantly depending on if we were looking at a 1 year or a 2 year time frame across socioeconomic groups and across individual food categories. The larger impact in 2020 than in 2021, but was, as of the 2021, still not back to the pre-pandemic baseline in real terms. The food shares increased across the board, but by a much larger amount among the better off deciles, and some evidence that the PDES was playing a mitigating role in terms of the impact of COVID on food spending. As we pointed out earlier on, the food expenditure declines were driven more by the demand side, so income and employment channels, not so much evidence for the supply side, like access to markets or food availability. There seems to have been, on some levels, a shift to more healthier behaviors, particularly in the food basket and especially among the poor. But the tobacco share seems to have gone up. Again, households with kids under 6 experienced larger declines in food expenditure, but they were mostly concentrated among the less nutritious food items. So just sort of a final takeaway that it's useful to understand some of the mechanisms to help protect household food consumption in the face of shocks. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from all of you and getting your feedback. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica and Owen. So we'll open up for questions and discussions and your insights. Any feedback as well, because the team is wanting to hear from the fraternity in terms of any specific reflections on this kind of analysis and data. So either you could just speak up or raise your hand in the chat box, and I'll try to facilitate so that Monica and Owen will answer questions and discuss. Over to all of you. Anyone?
I think I raised my hand. This is Purnima.
Yeah, sorry, Purnima, I didn't see. Please go ahead. Please go ahead, Purnima.
It's frozen.
Yeah.
Just want to
Purnima,
okay, hopefully, can you hear me now?
yes.
Yeah, I think my internet has decided it's enough on a Friday afternoon. But no, I just wanted to say it was a great presentation. There's always a lot to think about here. And I've been involved in some other conversations with our colleagues at ISPRI as well about who the CMIE includes and who's not included in the CMIE in terms of representativeness, etc. So I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit on that. And I know you're probably, of course, see Jean and Anu, Sumanji, etc. So it would be great, the nutrition community necessarily isn't connected into those data criticisms or discussions among the economists. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on that. And then the second question I had is, what's your sense of how the policy community that looks at these issues and economic issues in India is responding to these findings? We've been discussing And actually, just earlier today, I think or yesterday, we're having some discussions about how, the kinds of food price and food insecurity issues that one is seeing will really affect the impact of behavior change programs. Of course, you've shown us a pretty nice mixed picture there, so there's still a lot to wrap our heads around in terms of healthy foods versus unhealthy foods, etc. But this is a really good entry point for those discussions for the nutrition community. But yeah, I think it's two questions. One is the representativeness and who the data captures and what it leaves out, and then the second is the policy engagement and receptivity to these findings. Thanks.
Yeah, I can probably answer the first one, and maybe Owen can answer the second one. So in terms of representativeness of the CPHS data, as far as I know, is nationally representative. I mean, the only segment of the populations that is excluded from the survey is the homeless, because the CPHS data uses the physical housing structure as its ultimate sampling units. Currently, I think Pedro Olinto from the poverty team at the World Bank here, who's joining, maybe can talk in more detail, like about the World Bank's effort right now in order to try to really like match the CPHS data with the population census essentially, and really like see where are the gaps in terms of representativeness. But as far as I know is that it's nationally representative, and they include like all populations, and the only excluded segment of the populations are the homeless.
Thanks, Monica. So I'll make just a brief comment, and then I don't know if Pedro wants to come in on this, but yeah, there's also been this concern that the way in which CMI selects households is their sort of starting point down the field is missing some of the poorest of the poor. I know that's something that I think Andres and others had flagged. So our colleagues in the Poverty GP have just recently completed this study, which got quite a bit of attention over the last month, looking at poverty trends in India over several years. I'm not qualified to speak to that, except to say that they had done a lot of work to try to make CMIE comparable to NSS by adjusting for the sample, and to try to deal with some of these issues around the representativeness of CMIE. So we have not used those weights there. In principle, we could. I think as a sort of a broader point, missing the poorest to the poor is, of course, if indeed that's the case, is certainly a problem and an issue. But we also face this difficulty where we don't have a lot of alternatives in a sense. Right? So we would prefer to have better data, more representative data around the margins. But I'm not sure that would necessarily drastically change some of the storylines there. So I guess I'll leave it at that. And if Pedro wants to come and speak to this, he can. But I think we take your point, Burnham, that this is certainly a concern with the CMIE, and some of our colleagues have been trying to address that. On the while I have the floor on the second point, I think some of you might have more to say on that than we do in terms of the sort of receptivity to this. We have not taken this to government at this stage. We hope to do so, but we would very much like to hear from you in terms of some of the interpretations. And I think some of our social protection colleagues have also looked at the sort of responsiveness of some of the safety net programs that were rolled out in the context of COVID. So I saw Pedro just very briefly. Pedro, do you want to come in?
Sure, yes. My internet is not very good today, so I might have to turn the video off. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So.
Yes.
Yeah, so yes, the issue of the sampling of the CPHS is something that we work very hard to try to adjust as much as possible to be comparable to what an NSS survey would do. So what was done, in a very summarized way, is to look at other representative surveys that were done by MOSPI during the period of the labor force survey, and there was another, I think the health survey and other surveys, which don't have consumption and the welfare measurement that we use to measure poverty, but they have other variables like education, housing, and so we try to look at the types of households that were underweighted in the CPHS survey compared to the other national representative surveys. And we then recalculate the weights to try to match as much as possible the distribution of welfare between the NSS and the CPHS. Now, of course, missing households, as Monica was saying, of the homeless, but this would not solve that problem. But the NSS also has problems capturing the homeless, by the way they do the sampling. So we think that with the information that we have the best possible comparison to the NSS to measure poverty. And I think perhaps another iteration of this analysis, I don't know, Monica and Owen, if you've done that, is perhaps to obtain the weights from Sutilka and Roy, and try to perhaps rerun some of this analysis with the new weights, which have just been published recently. I hope I have addressed your question. If not, let me know.
Yeah. So I mean, just to add to Pedro's response. So yeah, I did run some of the analysis with the weights that matches the NSS, and I think for most of the findings, the message did not change. So I did run some of the analysis with the NSS weights.
Oh, great, Monica. I didn't realize that. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on from Purnima, is there anybody else who wants to come in? Okay, yeah, Kia, please come. And then I also see Robert unmuted. I don't know whether he wants to. Go ahead, Kia.
So first of all, congratulations to the team for a brilliant survey and very insightful. One question I was particularly clarity and particularly needed. You mentioned key households or female majority households versus male or minority. I was wondering, is it like female households or is it female households? The members are female. I was not very clear at this point.
Yeah, so let me share my screen again. So CMIE creates its own like definitions of compositions of households by gender and also by other variables like by age, by occupation, and I will share with you their definitions of some of the terms that I use. Get screen here. Can can you see my slide? Okay.
We're seeing the earlier slide, yeah. You go to
Okay.
36. Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. So here are the CME definitions of household groupings that I use in the multivariate regressions. So for example, for gender compositions of households, they divide it into these different groups consisting of balance, female dominant, female majority, male dominant, male majority, female only, and male only. So the more detailed definitions of each of these gender group category is available in this YAMI website. And yeah, I might not be able to explain it like in more detail on top of my head, but then I'll be happy to come back to you with each of these definitions.
Thank you, Monica. Robert, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, hi, Robert. Go ahead.
Good, thank you. No, thank you for this this presentation. It's very interesting to see data that were collected all throughout the pandemic period. The first thing that sticks out to me is the decrease in purchase of produced food items, and this kind of goes against of what was reported in the news. And we do have data, on, for example, Carl G biscuits, who produce 400 million biscuits a day, and their sales went up 38% throughout the pandemic period. Now, do we know if those were purchased inside of India? Do we know if they were purchased, if they were exported? We don't know. But obviously there was a huge market response for these produced food items, low-cost, cheap biscuits. Now, was your survey done in different months where they couldn't detect this, or was there really no effect on reliance of produced food products like we believe throughout this period? Any other data? The analysis done in households under 6 years of age is very helpful. So we would like to be able to dig deeper into that and really see, if there is a true difference, but from start to finish on the available food products that were consumed by these foods, and to really see then later if we can trace that to any sort of impacts. Thanks again for all of your presentation.
Oh, you want to comment?
My interpretation of that is, I think it's called purchased and packaged food. Right? It's the name that CMI gives. And each of these 11 categories, they've aggregated a bunch of very specific items. So I don't know, there's maybe 100 or 120 questions in total, I remember exactly. And then they aggregate into these 11 categories. So what exactly is in the purchased and packaged food, I don't know, but I think it's this sort of the dried foods that one might find in a local shop. It's biscuits and other sort of manufactured foods like that. I could imagine that maybe there are specific items within that aggregate category that might have gone up, and perhaps the example you mentioned might have been one of those examples, but I guess this is somewhat aggregated category, and in aggregate it declined. And I guess on one level I would think it makes sense in the sense that packaged foods are somewhat more expensive than manufactured. So that would have been the first place to cut, whereas they kept going with the sort of grains and pulses and so on, which are not sort of repackaged. Monica, you might want to come in as well. you're on mute.
Yeah. So exactly what Owen said, I very much agree that I think it's because of this compiling of some of the purchase and package food that maybe on aggregate is actually declining, but for some specific packaged food like the biscuits that you mentioned, it might increase. So if we want to look at like some specific packaged food, maybe we need to break down this group of purchase and packaged food.
Okay, thank you, Monica and Owen. Robert, I mean, we can, as you've said, we can get into further conversation, specifics around, particularly around the biscuits issue, as well as what you asked for in terms of getting in, understanding better what information we have within the households with children under 6. In fact, we did, the World Bank Nutrition Team did dialogue with Monica and Owen around that. And we've had some preliminary discussions, but not robust enough. And the data has been coming in. Kira, you wanted to come in again? Or is that an old hand? Yes, go ahead.
One thing that was of real concern was the decline in animal proteins in their diets, and as it is, we are seeing dietary diversity and dietary adequacy, especially among children in the larger population also that's very limited. And so there's a decline that's definitely a matter of concern. So that is one thing.
Sorry, I couldn't really hear Kaya. What food items again that you mentioned?
I said that there is a decline in the consumption of animal proteins. So that is definitely a matter of concern, because as it is, we have seen that the dietary adequacy is very low in India. So, and especially among the lowest quintiles. So that definitely is a thing that we should be looking at. From the study, do we infer that people were actually cutting down costs and they were then using the saved money to buy healthier foods, except for, of course, the tobacco consumption that should increase. But otherwise, isn't something that we can infer that people have actually, because of there is a loss of livelihood and loss of economics, the earning, etc. And so people have kind of tried to cut down on unnecessary costs and tried to invest more on healthier options. Is that something we can infer from the study?
Yeah, so basically our findings show that yes, in terms of animal protein-rich food items, in terms of the level, the expenditure per capita, it decreased in mid 2021 compared to the pre-pandemic level by about 7-8%. But in terms of the share out of like total food expenditure, it's actually increased by a little. So I mean, like, yeah, there two different I guess like forces that are happening. Like in terms of level, it decreased compared to the pre-pandemic level, but in terms of share, it increased a little bit. And in terms of the policy, maybe Owen can say something on this.
And I think your second question was on whether we can infer that the shifts in the basket that buy a more nutritious food consumption, at least in shares, even if the quantities might have fallen. I mean, I think the findings are certainly suggestive of that. I think the slide we had shown that the ones that decreased included, where the shares decreased, it included sugar and other sweeteners, beverage and health supplements, and purchase and packaged foods. So those things are broadly, and you all could correct us if we're wrong, or perhaps the less nutritious, and the areas where the shares at least increased were the milk and milk products, vegetables, fruits, and so on. So it's suggestive of that. I wouldn't say it's necessarily 100% conclusive, but that's what it seems to be pointing to. I think, sorry, I missed Robert's earlier question, but I think this survey is sort of approximate information on issues of interest, like food spending. Of course, if we really want to know the ultimate impact in terms of nutrition, it will have to come from other surveys, most likely, like NFHS or others, if we want to really see the trends in stunting. But this is the data that is sort of high frequency and was able to be tracked through the pandemic period, but it's only suggestive of the ultimate outcomes that you refer to, that is what we really care about.
Thanks, Owen and Monica. Anyone else? Otherwise, we would.
Sorry, Deepika, can I just jump in a little
Of
bit
course.
to answer Robert's question? So I actually opened my file to look at what's in the purchase and packaged food grouping, and it does include food in restaurants and biscuits, chocolates, and I guess other snacks, salty snacks. So biscuits is part of it, but there's a lot of other things like jam, ketchup, and other things. So maybe because of this compilations of bunch of purchase and packaged food that on aggregate it declined, but maybe for some of more specific packaged food items like biscuits, it might increase. So we have to unpack some of the items if you want to look at like into more specific items.
Thank you, Monica. Is there anyone else online who wants to come in, or should we wrap up? Okay, I'll wait if there's anyone else. Meanwhile, Monica and Owen, I had a comment and a reflection. So as you finalize and I mean, of course, you get more insights and finalize the findings, and we get ready to share with the government. I think various parts of the government. I think. I guess you're aware. This has to be really made fairly explicit and clear in terms of how we sort of infer these findings. And needless to say, you're aware that they will be interested in what are the big conclusions, and therefore what are the implications for some of the sectors that we go back and share these findings with, be it Ministry of Health, Rural Development, or the Ministry of Women and Child. So just arriving at that with that clarity will be useful, and it's because it's just that they will not be able to sift and understand all this information, but would ask us and ask the teams whether this data and information is credible enough for them to move forward to and begin using in their own dialogue and any other, wherever they want to input or make sense of it. So that is important. This is also recent. This is coming from a recent experience we have had with the government, where we did. We actually commissioned the survey, and they are, several of these stakeholders are not able to completely comprehend, and then they just want to understand it with absolute clarity that this is what, to the kind of question that Kia asked, that do I infer it, saying that there was a shift to healthier food. So I think it just the kind of language and communication, I think all that will come later, but just that this group is also interested in how to use the findings, definitely on the research side, but then how do we use these findings and how do we take it forward, or how do we help you take this forward in terms of getting absorbed by our key counterparts. So that was the point that I wanted to read. So if there is no one else, then I would like to hand over to Aryan for his concluding remarks. Aryan, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, and also thanks to the presenters, to the other colleagues of the World Bank. Appreciate it. We've seen quite a bit of data and many different types of data studies being done in the last few years looking at these issues. And it's good to see some of the very thorough studies. Yeah, some of them have been done, and they point to similar directions. So that way it's nice to see this. My big question indeed, I think it was mentioned also, I think it was by you, Owen. At the end, of course, the question is, how was the response, and was the response appropriate, effective, targeted, and reaching those that needed it most? And that will provide us some of the lessons also for the future that I think will be interesting to share. You mentioned some of your points on social protection, safety nets, or safety nets might look at that. So it would be interesting to look at that. And to take some of the lessons also to government for those kind of response. But I find it very interesting, the colleagues know me a little bit, at least the colleagues that I worked with before, they know that how do they find the impact of COVID? Some of us would argue that what we see at the moment with tremendous inflation, that is also driven by some of the COVID impact. And therefore, many poor people are not yet out of the problem. And although we might not call it now a really core COVID or COVID immediate impact, I'm really worried what is happening around the world, but also definitely, of course, very clearly in India with substantially increasing food prices. And these continuous shocks, how is that going to be compounding, and how is it going to be ultimately affecting, and are the responses adequate? The kind of responses and the sensitivity to adjust the government response in time of COVID. Of course, we can say it was not enough. Those efforts were there. My question is, hey, with these more continuing economic challenges that we see at the moment, is the response appropriate, or do we not adequately see it? Because you don't have these big shocks or these big crisis, emergency happening that wakes all of us up. But I think these kind of reports are really going to help with that. I just want to thank you very much for sharing, and I also want to thank Deepika for reaching out to this group. And who is this group? It is this development partners working on nutrition information group, and it's a great platform to continue sharing. And at this time there were some other colleagues also from other organizations who also joined. So also I think for this one, actually Deepika and colleagues, you gave a good example how this group can be used. Actually, I like Friday afternoons for this. I think it's the right time before, so we have something to think about, chew around in the weekend as well. So let's open this also up for other colleagues in the future. If you have some kind of thorough pieces of work done, let's start sharing this. Let's just call the meeting together and let's share and learn together. Again, thanks very much to all of you. Also thanks to Kea for reaching out and putting it all together to share and promote the event and coordinate the event. So thanks very much. Deepika, any last words from your side?
No, just thank you very much for everyone to come together. We're going to use this platform. And thank you to Monica and Owen to to so patiently take us through this work environment. I've been off and on engaged with the work they have done, but today we were looking at it in totality. And thank you for sharing. And I think some of our reflections and insights will help them finalize what they are planning to take forward.
And the people are going to be, are we allowed to share the recording of this session as well as the PowerPoint? Is that possible?
Owen?
I think that should be okay. I mean, we're yet to go to the government, so I think we'll need to do that first. So we can discuss that because just so we don't
Right.
hit crossed wires.
Yes.
Good. We'll share the recording with Deepika, and then Deepika can disseminate it together with other materials when appropriate. Okay, colleagues, have a lovely weekend. And hope to see you again also. And Monica, Owen, thanks for joining, and hope that you keep joining us as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.